The man fell through her barn doors at midnight, bleeding so freely that the straw beneath him turned black before she could even find her lantern. Clara Whitmore had been lying awake in the farmhouse when she heard the sound, something between a groan and a thud, rattling the loose plank walls of the barn she had inherited along with 30 acres of dry Texas grassland after her father died 2 winters past. It was the autumn of 1882, the kind of October that came in cool and sharp-edged, and she had been reading by candlelight, not sleeping, which was why she was dressed and on her feet within 30 seconds of hearing that terrible sound. She grabbed the lantern from the kitchen table, the old shotgun from behind the door, and crossed the yard with her heart hammering in her chest. The barn doors stood open by about 2 feet, one of them swinging slightly in the wind off the plains. She raised the lantern first, then the gun, and pushed through. He was on the ground between the first 2 stalls, face down, one hand stretched out as if he had been reaching for something he never found. His coat was dark brown leather, worn thin at the elbows, and the left side of it was soaked entirely through with blood that was still running. His hat had fallen off and rolled against the base of the stall. His horse, a big roan mare, stood just inside the door, trembling and breathing in short, sharp bursts, the reins trailing in the dirt. "Lord have mercy," Clara whispered. She set the shotgun against the wall and knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. The pulse was there, weak and thready, but there. She rolled him carefully onto his back and lifted the lantern over his face. He was a young man, she thought, somewhere in his middle 20s, with dark hair matted at the temples with sweat and dust. He had several days of stubble across a jaw that was square and strong, and even in unconsciousness his brow was creased with something that looked like pain. His coat had been tied shut with a strip of leather someone had wound around his torso, a crude field bandage over what turned out, when she peeled the coat open, to be a bullet wound just below his left ribs. She did not panic. Her father had been a rough man who kept rough company, and she had tended wounds before, though none quite as serious as this one. She grabbed the clean horse blankets from the corner, folded one beneath his head, and ran back to the house for water and her medicine tin. She came back with a pot of water she set to heat over the small iron stove in the corner of the barn that her father had used on cold mornings, a roll of bandage cloth, a bottle of carbolic that she used sparingly because it was expensive and hard to come by, and a sewing needle already threaded with strong wax thread. She worked for 2 hours in the lantern light, speaking softly to him even though he did not respond, because she had found that speaking calmly to a person in distress, conscious or not, seemed to matter. She cleaned the wound carefully, pulled the fabric of his shirt away from the edges, and did what she could to close it. The bullet had passed through, which was the single piece of luck the night had to offer. She stitched him up as best she knew how, bandaged him tightly, and then simply sat back on her heels and looked at him. He had nothing on him that told her who he was. No papers, no identification of any kind. His coat pockets held a pocket knife, a few coins, and a short stub of pencil. His saddlebag, which she fetched from the trembling roan and finally managed to calm the horse enough to settle into an empty stall, held a change of shirt, a small worn Bible, a tin of tobacco he apparently did not use but carried anyway, and a bundle of letters tied with brown string. She did not open the letters that night. That felt too much like trespassing on a man's private life. She left them on the shelf above the stall, covered him with the cleanest horse blanket she had, built up the stove a little higher against the cold, and went back to the house to wash the blood from her hands. She did not sleep that night, and by morning he still had not woken. The letters sat on that shelf for 3 days before she allowed herself to look at them, and only because she needed to find out who he was in order to send word to his family. She was practical enough to recognize that if he died, someone would need to be told. She untied the brown string with careful fingers and opened the first envelope. The handwriting inside was her own. The letter was dated the 14th of July, 1882, and it began with the words she herself had written sitting at her kitchen table on a stifling summer afternoon. Dear Mr. Cole Mackay, am writing in response to your advertisement in the Amarillo Weekly Gazette seeking correspondence from a woman of good character and serious disposition. Am 23 years of age and I manage my father's farm outside the town of Crestwater, and I believe I qualify on both counts. Clara sat down very slowly in the straw beside the unconscious man and read the entire letter, which was of course her own words coming back to her in her own handwriting, and then she put it down and looked at his face for a long time. Cole Mackay. She had written to this man. She had written to this man 4 times over the course of the summer and into the early fall, and he had written back to her in a hand that was not elegant but was earnest and clean, and they had told each other things that she had never told anyone else. She had told him about the loneliness of running a farm alone. He had told her about the open country and what it felt like to ride for days without seeing another living soul, and how that felt both free and terrifying at the same time. She had told him about her father's death and how the grief had come in waves that she did not expect. He had told her about his mother, who had died when he was 16, and about the brother he had lost in a cattle drive accident 2 years before the letters began. She knew this man. She did not know his face because they had never met, and there had been no photograph exchanged, but she knew him in the way you could only know a person you had been entirely honest with in writing, which was a particular kind of knowing that had no substitute. And now he was lying in her barn, half dead, with her letters in his coat. She put her hand over her mouth and sat there for a full minute before she got herself together. He was running a fever by the second day, which she had expected. She moved him into the house because the barn was too cold for a sick man, and because she could not watch him properly from across the yard. She made up the narrow bed in her father's old room, and with considerable effort, enlisting the help of old Pete Gallagher from the neighboring farm who asked no questions and demanded no explanations, she got Cole Mackay into the house and into the bed. She made broth from the chicken she had been saving and sat beside him through the worst of the fever, putting cool, wet cloths on his forehead and talking to him, telling him things she might not have said if she thought he could hear her. She told him she had his letters memorized in places. She told him she had been looking forward to his letters more than she looked forward to anything else that happened in her weeks. She told him she had been frightened that he would stop writing, that some arrangement would fall through, or some other woman from another town would catch his attention, and she would be left wondering whatever had become of the cowboy who wrote about the smell of rain on open grass as if it were something sacred. On the 3rd morning the fever broke. She was sitting in the ladder-back chair beside his bed, her chin dropped to her chest, having fallen asleep somewhere around 4 in the morning. She woke to the sound of movement and opened her eyes to find him looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man trying very hard to remember where he was and how he had gotten there. She straightened in the chair, pushed her hair back from her face, and said, "Good morning." He turned his head slowly and looked at her. His eyes were a dark, serious gray, and even in their current state of confusion and exhaustion they had a quality of attention to them that she recognized from his letters. He had written that he was a man who paid attention to things. She could see that it was true. "Where am I?" he said. His voice was rough with disuse and thirst, and it was a low voice, unhurried even now. "You are in Crestwater, Texas," she said. "In my farmhouse. You came through my barn doors 3 nights ago and frightened my horse considerably. My name is Clara Whitmore." Something moved across his face then, something quick and complicated that she could not quite read. He said nothing for a moment. His hand, which had been lying flat at his side, moved slightly as if he were searching for something. "Your letters are safe," she said quietly. "They are on the shelf in the barn. We'll get them for you when you are stronger." He looked at her then with an expression she would later describe to herself as a man standing at the edge of something he had not planned to reach for a very long time. He said, "You read them." It was not an accusation exactly. It was more a statement of the reality of the situation, laid flat and plain. "I did," she said. "I had to find out who you were. I needed to know if there was family to contact in case you—" She stopped and then said plainly, "In case you did not survive." He was quiet a moment. "And when you read them," he said, "did you recognize the handwriting?" "I recognized my own," she said. There was a long pause then, the kind of pause that has weight to it, that takes up space in the room like a third person. The morning light was coming in through the single window in pale strips across the floor, and somewhere outside a meadowlark was calling in the dry grass. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was riding to Crestwater," he said. "Had been riding for 4 days. I wanted to—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. He was clearly still in pain. "I wanted to meet you properly. Had written to say I was coming. Did you receive the letter?" She shook her head slowly. "The last letter I had from you was the one dated the 2nd of September, she said. "That was 6 weeks ago." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, though it cost him something in the way of pain to do it. "I sent it 3 weeks ago," he said. "I sent it from Dodge City. The post from there is not reliable." "No," she agreed. "It is not." He looked at the ceiling again. "I did not plan to arrive quite like this," he said. "No," she said. "I expect you did not." She got him water, and then broth, and she changed his dressing while he sat very still and bore it with a kind of quiet stoic dignity that she had not expected from someone so clearly suffering. When she was done, he thanked her with a formality that was somehow entirely sincere, not stiff, not performative, just the genuine expression of a man who meant what he said when he said it. She left him to sleep and went to do her morning chores, and when she came back in at noon, he was sitting up against the headboard, looking out the window at the flat spread of land beyond the fence line, and the expression on his face was the same expression she had read in his letters. A man who looked at open country and felt something complicated and deep about it. She made them both lunch, and they ate in a companionable quiet that surprised her with how easy it was. "You are not what I expected," he said finally, as she gathered the bowls. She looked at him. "What did you expect?" He thought about it honestly. "Someone more cautious," he said. "Someone who kept more distance." "You were bleeding through my barn floor," she said. Distance seemed impractical. He smiled then for the first time, and it was the kind of smile that arrived slowly and settled in his eyes more than his mouth. And she found that she had to look away from it after a moment because it had an effect on her that she was not prepared for in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He was bedridden for 10 days. During those 10 days, they talked more freely and more honestly than Clara had talked with any person in her memory. They talked in the mornings when she brought his breakfast, and in the afternoons when she had a spare hour from the farm work, and sometimes in the evenings by lamplight when the wind came up off the plains and rattled the window glass, and it seemed sensible to stay inside rather than brave the porch. He told her about himself in the way that people do when they have already been honest in writing, and there is nothing left to hide. He had been born in New Mexico Territory in 1858, making him 24 years old, which was exactly 1 year older than she was. His father had been a ranch hand who drifted, and his mother had been a woman of considerable determination who had kept the family fed and housed through sheer will, until she got sick, and then there was no more keeping anything. Cole had gone to work at 14 on a cattle ranch outside of Santa Fe and had been working cattle ever since, learning the land and the work with the kind of thoroughness that only comes from having nothing else to fall back on. He was not a violent man, though he had lived among them. The bullet wound, when she finally got the story of it, came from a disagreement between 2 trail bosses outside of Dodge City, in which he had been very much an uninvolved bystander who had happened to be standing in an unfortunate location, when one of the trail bosses decided that conversation was insufficient. He had ridden away from it because there had been no better option, and he had ridden 4 days before the blood loss, and the fever brought him down. "You could have stopped in a town," she said when she heard this. "You could have found a doctor. I was past Tascosa when it got bad," he said. "There was nothing between there and here that I trusted." She thought about this. "You trusted here," she said. "You did not know this farm. You could not have known I would take you in." He was quiet for a moment. "I was coming here regardless," he said. "It seemed to me that if I was going to collapse somewhere, it might as well be where I was headed." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he looked out the window and the afternoon passed. On the 5th day she brought him his letters from the barn shelf, all 4 of hers bundled together, and set them on the nightstand without comment. He picked them up and held them but did not open them, just held the bundle as if the familiar weight of them was itself a kind of comfort. "My letters are in the saddlebag," he said. "The ones from you. You can read them again if you like. You already have read them." "I have," she said. "Then you know that I have been honest," he said. "I know that," she said. "Good," he said, and set the bundle of letters on the nightstand and looked at her directly. "Then I would like to continue being honest with you, Miss Whitmore, and I would ask that you continue being honest with me." "I have not stopped," she said. "No," he said. "Did not think you had." The smile came again, slow and settling, and this time she let herself look at it for a moment before she looked away. The town of Crestwater was small enough that the news of an unknown man recovering in Clara Whitmore's farmhouse traveled through it the way all news traveled through small towns, which was to say completely and immediately. Mrs. Donahue from the dry goods store mentioned it to Reverend Marsh on Sunday, and Reverend Marsh mentioned it during the handshaking after the service to Tom Aldridge, who ran the livery. And Tom Aldridge told his wife, who told her sister, who told pretty much everyone else. Clara was aware of the talk. She had grown up in Crestwater, and she understood that talk was the price of living in a small place, and she did not particularly mind it because she had a clear conscience and had done nothing that required explanation or apology. She was nursing a wounded man back to health. If anyone found something scandalous in that, it reflected more on them than on her. What she minded somewhat more was when her nearest neighbor, a widow named Ruth Callan who kept a neat house and a critical eye, rode over on the 6th day with a pie and a great deal of pointed observation. Ruth was 50 and honest in the manner of a woman who had decided long ago that the world ran better on plain speech than on careful diplomacy. She came into the kitchen, set the pie on the table, and looked at Clara with the assessing gaze of someone conducting an audit. "He is awake, then," Ruth said. "He has been awake since the 3rd morning," Clara said. "Sit down, Ruth. We'll make coffee. Who is he?" "His name is Cole Mackay. He is a cowboy from New Mexico. He was shot outside of Dodge City and rode 4 days before he found his way here." Ruth sat down. She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating, because she had come expecting one kind of story and had received another. "Shot," she said. "Shot," Clara confirmed and poured the coffee. "Was he a wanted man?" "He was not. He was a bystander in someone else's argument." Ruth considered this. "And you know him how, exactly?" Clara set the coffee cups on the table and sat down across from her neighbor and said, "I have been corresponding with him. By letter. Since July." Ruth looked at her with an expression that moved rapidly through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been the beginning of approval. "The advertisement," she said slowly, "in the Gazette." "Yes," Clara said. "I saw it," Ruth said. "I wondered if you had answered it." "I did," Clara said. "And he is the man. He is the man." Ruth picked up her coffee cup and looked at it and then looked at Clara. "Well," she said, "that is either the most romantic thing I have ever heard or the most alarming, and I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps it is both," Clara said, and Ruth's mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile. Ruth met Cole that afternoon briefly, standing in the doorway of the bedroom while he sat up against the headboard looking out the window, and Clara watched Ruth's expression do several rapid adjustments as she assessed him. Cole met her gaze steadily, and with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and said, "Good afternoon, ma'am," and thanked her for the pie. And Ruth came back to the kitchen and reported to Clara that he had good manners and honest eyes, which was, coming from Ruth, a stronger endorsement than a lesser person might have produced in a full paragraph. On the 8th day, Cole was well enough to sit on the porch. Clara brought 2 chairs out and they sat in the thin October sunlight and looked at the land together. The grass was turning gold and the sky above the flat horizon was the particular enormous blue that the sky got in Texas in October, impossibly wide and deep, the kind of sky that made you feel simultaneously very small and very connected to something large. "This is good land," he said. "It is dry," she said. "Everything out here is dry. That does not make it less good." She looked at him. "You are trying to say something kind about my farm." "Am saying something true about your farm," he said. "There is a difference." She looked back at the land. The fence needed repairing on the south side, and the windmill above the stock tank wanted a new blade, and the north pasture was growing rough with mesquite that needed clearing. And she knew all of this because she walked it every morning and thought about it every evening. The farm was hers, genuinely and completely hers in a way that very few things in a woman's life in 1882 were allowed to be genuinely and completely hers, and she felt the complexity of that, the pride and the burden of it in equal measure. "My father left it to me because there was no one else," she said. "There was a time when I thought I would have to sell. The first winter was very bad, but I did not sell." "No," he said, "you did not." He paused. "I read that in your second letter, that you had considered selling and had decided not to. You said that the land was the only honest thing left." She was surprised for a moment that he had remembered the exact phrasing, and then not surprised at all because she had memorized parts of his letters too, and she understood that kind of remembering. "It is still the only honest thing," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the horizon. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "You have been calling me Miss Whitmore for 8 days," she said. "My name is Clara." He looked at her. "Clara," he said, and her name in his voice was something she felt rather than heard, somewhere in the region of her chest. "I came here with a purpose," he said. "Told you that. Was riding here to meet you properly, and I had thought." He stopped and started again. "Had thought that when I arrived I would be a good deal more presentable, and that we would meet at the door like ordinary people, and that I would take my hat off and say my name and you would say yours, and we would take it from there in a civilized fashion. Instead," she said carefully. "Instead," he said, "you pulled a bullet wound closed with a needle and thread and nursed me through a fever for 3 days. Which is a more thorough introduction than anything I had planned." "It is," she agreed. "What I mean to say," he said, and stopped again, and there was something almost rare in watching a man who was clearly not accustomed to fumbling for words fumbling for them. "What I mean to say is that it has not gone the way I expected. But I find that I am not sorry about that. Find that he looked at his hands, then back at her. "Find that I know you better than I expected to know anyone, and that is not a complaint. That is as far from a complaint as I know how to get." The meadowlark called somewhere in the grass beyond the fence, the same one or one of its kind, and the wind moved through the dry grass in a long, soft wave. "Am glad you did not die in my barn," Clara said. He looked at her steadily. "So am I," he said. And then the slow smile came, and this time she did not look away from it. That evening, after supper, she got out his letters. Not hers, but his, the ones he had written to her across the summer and fall, the ones she had kept in the blue tin box in the kitchen dresser. She set them on the table between them, and he looked at them as if he had not entirely expected to see his own handwriting again. She picked up the first one from the 15th of July, which was his response to her opening letter. She read a line from the middle of the page. "You mentioned that the farm is solitary work," she read aloud, And I think you are right, but suspect you are the kind of person who makes good use of solitude, and that is a different thing from loneliness." She set the letter down. "Kept every single one," she said. "I read them more than once. Kept every single one of yours," he said. "You can see that." "Yes," she said. "They were in your coat. I was writing to you," he said simply. "It seemed right to carry them." She looked at him across the lamplight and the table and the autumn dark outside, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time, something that she had not even fully recognized as unsettled until it stopped moving. "Cole," she said, using his name for the first time. "Yes," he said. "Stay," she said, "not because you are not well enough to ride. You will be well enough soon. Stay because I would like you to." He looked at her for a long moment with those serious gray eyes, and then he said, "I was not planning to leave." He stayed. He moved from the bedroom to the barn once he was strong enough, because the propriety of the situation required it, and because he understood that her reputation in the town of Crestwater mattered, and that he did not intend to be the cause of any damage to it. He set up a clean corner of the barn near the stove and declared it perfectly comfortable, which she doubted but appreciated. He was up and moving within 2 weeks of arriving, moving carefully, minding the wound but moving, and he began doing the work of the farm the way he began everything, quietly and thoroughly, and without waiting to be asked. He mended the fence on the south pasture, rising before dawn and working through the morning until the heat climbed. He replaced the windmill blade above the stock tank, climbing the structure with a carefulness that made her nervous watching from below, but that he accomplished without incident. He began clearing the mesquite from the north pasture, methodical about it, taking down a section a day. He had worked cattle his whole life, and he understood land, understood it in the particular way that people who have spent their lives outdoors understand it, which is not just intellectual but physical, a reading of the soil and the grass and the sky that is almost instinctive. He walked the property on the third day and came back and sat across from her at the kitchen table and talked to her about what the land needed, not in the manner of a man telling a woman what to do with her property, but in the manner of a person sharing an honest assessment with another person he respects. And she listened because what he said was right, and because she appreciated the approach. She told him about the difficulties of the past 2 years, the dry summer of 1881 that had killed half the kitchen garden, the herd she had reduced to 12 cattle because she could not manage more on her own, the arrangement she had with Tom Aldridge's son to help during the planting season, and again during the harvest in exchange for a portion of the yield. She told him about the negotiations she had made and the accommodations she had accepted and the ones she had refused, and he listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he brought to the horizon. "You have managed this very well," he said when she was finished. "I have managed it," she said. "Whether it has been managed well is a separate question." "It is the same question," he said. "You are still here. The land is still yours. The cattle are thin, but they are standing. That is managing something well." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning low between them. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the grass in long sighing waves. "You are a forthright person," she said. "Have been told so," he said. "It does not always go over well." "It goes over well with me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Had gathered that," he said, and something in the air between them shifted, warmed, became something she could feel on her skin. The autumn deepened. The days shortened and the nights came down cold, and the stars above the Texas plains were brilliant and close in the clear dark air. Clara began to understand what she was feeling with more precision, which was to say she stopped pretending to herself that it was something other than what it was. She was falling in love with Cole Mackay in the thorough and irreversible way that you fell in love with someone you had known through letters before you knew their face, which was a love built on a foundation of honest words, and she trusted it in a way she could not have fully explained but did not need to. She saw him falling too. It was not obvious, because he was not an obvious man, but she was a careful observer, and she paid attention. She noticed that he found reasons to be wherever she was in the course of the day, not intrusively, not hovering, but nearby, as if proximity to her was something he wanted and had stopped apologizing for wanting. She noticed that he listened to her with a quality of attention that was different from ordinary listening, the kind that meant he was not waiting for his turn to speak, but was actually hearing what she said and keeping it. She noticed that when she laughed, which was not something she had done much in the past 2 years, his whole expression changed, opened, became something soft and undefended. One afternoon in the middle of November, nearly 6 weeks after his arrival, she came out of the house with a letter she had been writing and sat on the porch steps with it, looking it over, and he came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her. "What are you writing?" He said. "A letter," she said. "To whom?" She looked up at him. The afternoon light was long and amber over the grass, and it caught the edge of his face and his shoulders and turned everything warm. "I had thought," she said carefully, "about writing to the editor of the Amarillo Weekly Gazette to ask that the advertisement be removed." He stood very still. "Cole Mackay's advertisement for correspondence," she continued, "seeking a woman of good character. Thought perhaps it should come down, since the advertiser has found what he was looking for and is no longer in need of further correspondence." He came to the porch steps and sat down on the lower one, turning so that he was looking up at her, his elbows on his knees, and his expression was the one she thought of as his honest one, which was not the same as his serious one, though they sometimes overlapped. "Is that so?" he said. "That is so," she said, "unless you disagree." "I do not disagree," he said. "Only want to be certain we are speaking about the same thing." "I am speaking about the fact that I love you," she said clearly, because she was a direct person when directness was called for, and she felt strongly that this was one of those occasions. "And I believe you love me, and I think we should stop pretending otherwise and decide what we intend to do about it." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I have loved you since July, since the first letter. Did not know your face, but I knew who you were, and I have not stopped." The evening star had appeared on the horizon, early and bright, and the land stretched away in every direction in its enormous silence, and she felt it like a physical thing, the rightness of this moment, the way certain things fall into place with a clarity that asks for no explanation. "Then we are decided," she said. "We are decided," he said, and reached up and took her hand in both of his and held it. They married in December of 1882, which everyone in Crestwater agreed was either very fast or entirely sensible, depending on whether you thought letters counted as courtship, and which Clara and Cole agreed it was in no way their job to arbitrate. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony in the small white church at the edge of town on a cold, bright Saturday morning. Ruth Callan stood up with Clara, and old Pete Gallagher stood up with Cole, and there were perhaps 40 people present, which was most of the population of Crestwater able to attend on short notice. Clara wore the dress she had made the previous spring from blue wool and wore her mother's earrings, which were small and silver, and the only pieces of jewelry she owned. Cole wore his best coat, which was not the battered brown one that had arrived soaked through on her barn floor, but a dark wool coat he had bought from the dry goods store, and which fitted him well enough that even Mrs. Donahue, who was not given to compliments, said he looked very decent. He put the ring on her finger with steady hands and said the words with the directness he brought to everything he said, and when Reverend Marsh pronounced them married, he kissed her in the manner of a man who had thought about doing so for a considerable amount of time and had found it worth the waiting, and the 40 people present made a respectable amount of noise about it. Afterward there was pie at the church hall, Ruth's contribution and 3 others from various women of the congregation, and coffee, and a fiddle player Tom Aldridge's son produced from somewhere, and Clara danced with her husband in front of everyone she had ever known, which was something she had not done in so long that she had half forgotten how much she liked it, and Cole turned out to be a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him. "My mother taught me," he said. "She said a man who cannot dance is only half a man." Those were her words exactly. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Clara said. "She was," he said, and something moved briefly in his face, affection and grief and pride all traveling through together. "She would have liked you considerably. I would have liked to know her," Clara said, and meant it. They walked home in the early evening, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, across the flat land with the sky above them the particular deep indigo that it got at December dusk over Texas. And Cole reached over and took her hand, and she let him take it, and they walked the rest of the way like that, not saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one in the practical sense, the way winters on Texas farms were reliably hard, with a cold that came early and stayed, and feed costs that rose and cattle prices that did not, and a stretch in February where it did not get above freezing for 2 weeks, and they had to haul warm water to the stock tank twice a day to keep it from icing solid. But it was not hard between them. It was, in fact, the opposite of hard between them. It was easy in the way that only things built on honest foundations are easy, without the strain that comes from performing for another person or maintaining a version of yourself that is not entirely true. They worked side by side and they talked through the evenings, and they figured out the small geography of sharing a life with a thoroughness and a willingness to say plainly, when something was not working, that made the adjustments quick and mostly painless. They disagreed about things because they were both people with opinions and the capacity to defend them, but they disagreed honestly and resolved it honestly and moved on without carrying the residue of it into the next day. Cole sent to Santa Fe for his few remaining possessions, which fit in a single crate and arrived by freight in March. Among them were the tools of his trade, good working gear, rope and a spare saddle, and a set of spurs his father had left behind when he drifted out the final time, and a book of surveying principles that he had been teaching himself from in spare hours on the trail, and that Clara found interesting enough to read herself. There were also 2 letters he had received from her, and kept separate from the bundle, in an inside coat pocket, which she recognized as meaning they were the ones he carried closest. She did not ask which ones, she thought she knew. In the spring, they planted the kitchen garden larger than she had managed it alone, and put in a second crop of oat grass in the north pasture now that the mesquite was cleared. Cole took on some work from a neighboring cattleman, Jake Rhodes, who ran a larger operation and needed a skilled hand for the spring drive, and he was gone 10 days in April for that. And Clara ran the farm alone during those 10 days the way she had been running it before he arrived. But it felt different now, not because she was less capable alone than she had been, but because she knew he was coming back. He came back trail-dusty and tired and considerably more alive-looking than the last time he had arrived at her property, and she met him at the gate in the early evening when his horse came up the road, and he dismounted before he reached the gate and walked the last 50 yards to her, and she walked to meet him. And they came together in the middle of the lane with the spring grass coming up green on either side, and the evening star just appearing above the flat line of the west, and he held her against him with both arms, careful of his side which still pulled sometimes when he moved a certain way, and she held him back. "Missed you," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I missed you too. The farm's still standing. The farm is always standing," she said. "Kept it standing for 2 years without you." 10 days was manageable. He laughed, low and easy, and she felt it against her chest. "Yes," he said. "I expect it was." Summer came in hot and golden, and the oat grass grew well in the cleared north pasture, and the kitchen garden produced more than she had hoped, and they sold the surplus at the Crestwater market on Saturdays, Clara behind the table with the vegetables and Cole loading, and unloading with the cheerful competence of a man who knows what his hands are for. Jake Rhodes offered Cole a more permanent arrangement in June, a foreman position on the Rhodes ranch, which paid a regular wage and which Cole brought home and set on the kitchen table between them like an item for discussion rather than a decision already made. "It is a good offer," Clara said. "It is," he said. "It would mean regular pay through the winter," she said, "which would let us repair the south wall of the barn without drawing down the reserves. It would also mean I'm on Rhodes' land 12 hours most days," he said, "and I like being on this land." She looked at him across the table. The summer evening was coming in through the open door, warm and smelling of grass. "We could manage both," she said. "The farm is running better than it was. If you take the foreman work through the year and we keep the farm running, by next spring we might be in a position to buy the Gallagher parcel on the east side, if Pete is still thinking of selling." Cole was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "Pete mentioned it to me last month," he said. "He is thinking of moving to Amarillo to be near his daughter." "If we got that parcel," Clara said, "we could run 30 head instead of 12 and still have the north pasture for grain." He looked at her steadily. "You have been thinking about this." "Think about the land," she said. "Think about it all the time." "You know that." "I do," he said. He was quiet another moment. 30 head, he said. "By the following spring," she said. "Possibly 40. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his thumb moved across her knuckles in the way it did when he was thinking something he was glad about. "Clara Mackay," he said, "you are an extraordinary woman." She felt the warmth of it and smiled. "I'm a practical one," she said. "The two are not mutually exclusive," he said, and she laughed, and outside the summer evening settled over the Texas grass and the last of the light went gold and long across the floor. He took the foreman position with Rhodes. He was good at it, which surprised no one who knew him, and which earned him the respect of the hands he managed in the particular way respect was earned in that world, which was through competence and fairness, and the willingness to do the same work you were asking other men to do. He came home dusty and tired most evenings, and she had supper on the table and they ate together and talked about the day. And the evenings were the best part of both their days, she thought, though Cole said the best part of his day was the moment his horse came around the bend in the road and he could see the farmhouse. She was going to tell him something important in September. She was not precisely sure how to begin, which was unusual for her. She was generally good at beginning things, but this was different in a way she did not entirely know how to articulate. She had suspected for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks examining the suspicion from every angle before she arrived at certainty, and even then she had sat with it another week, not from fear but from the particular private pleasure of knowing something extraordinary before anyone else does. She told him on a Sunday evening, when the weather had just begun to turn, the first edge of fall coming into the air, sitting on the porch steps in the fading evening light. She said it plainly, which was her way. She said, "Cole, there is going to be a child." He was very still for a moment, the way he went still when something mattered enormously to him, and then he turned and looked at her, and his face was open in a way she had only seen a handful of times, undefended and full of something she could only call wonder, which was not a word she used carelessly. "Are you certain?" he said. "Am certain," she said. He reached out and put his hand against her face, cupping her cheek in his palm, and she leaned into it, and he said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her, and she could see everything he was feeling moving through his face the way weather moved across the sky, too large and too varied to contain but running clean and honest. "A child," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Our child," he said, as if clarifying something for himself. "Our child," she confirmed. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, and they sat like that on the porch steps with the evening coming down around them, and the first stars appearing above the flat dark line of the horizon, and she could feel his breathing, steadying, deepening, becoming the breathing of a man who has received something he had wanted for longer than he knew. "I did not have a father to speak of," he said quietly after a while. "I know," she said. "Have thought about that," he said. "About what it means for a child not to have," he stopped. Have thought about what I wanted to do differently. You will, she said simply. He lifted his head and looked at her. You are very certain. Am certain of you, she said. Have been certain of you since your second letter. He smiled at that slowly, the smile settling in his eyes. The second letter, he said. You wrote about your brother, she said. About the way he used to whistle when he was thinking, and how you still sometimes heard it when you were out on the open range and the wind was right. That is the letter where I knew who you were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I remember writing that. Almost did not send it. It seemed too much. It was not too much, she said. It was exactly right. He took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch steps until the full dark came and the stars spread out above them in their dense and brilliant thousands. And she thought, as she sometimes did at moments like this, about the strange and specific path that had led to this porch step, this evening, this man beside her, and thought there was no other word for it but grace. The baby arrived on a cold morning in May of 1884, a boy they named James after Cole's brother, and also Emmett after Clara's father, and who came into the world with a great deal of noise and energy that suggested he intended to take up considerable space in it. Cole was there for the birth, which was not universal in 1882 among the men Clara knew, but which he had stated plainly he intended to be and had been, and the look on his face when the midwife, a steady and practical woman named Mrs. Holt, placed the baby in his arms, was something Clara kept in her memory thereafter with the same care she gave to things that were irreplaceable. He held his son as if the boy were both the most fragile and the most important thing he had ever held, which was accurate on both counts, and he said nothing for what felt like a very long time, just looked at the baby's red and furious face, and then he looked at Clara, who was exhausted and sore and entirely happy, and he said, He has your nose. Every baby has my nose, she said. Clara, he said, and there was the sound of her name in his voice that she would never entirely get used to, the particular weight of it. Thank you, he said. For everything, for all of it. You are thanking me for having a baby, she said. Am thanking you for writing a letter in July of 1882, he said, to a cowboy you had never met. Am thanking you for that. She looked at him holding their son in the spring morning light and felt the love she had for this man as something physical and total, as present and real as the land outside the window, and she said, I'm glad the letter found you. So am I, he said. More than you know. She knew, in fact. She knew very well. James grew the way healthy children grow in good homes, fast and loud and with a great deal of will that Clara recognized as coming equally from both of them. He was walking before he was a year old and talking before he was 2, and following Cole around the farm from the moment he could keep up, which Cole permitted with a patient and steady delight that Clara watched from a distance sometimes and felt her heart do complicated things. Pete Gallagher did sell his parcel in the spring of 1884, 2 months before James was born, and Cole had ridden to Amarillo and negotiated the sale personally, and they had bought the eastern parcel with the money Cole had saved from the road's foreman work, and a portion of a loan from the Crestwater Bank that they paid back in 2 years, which was a year ahead of the schedule they had agreed to. The farm was now 50 acres, and they ran 30 cattle through that second spring, and by the summer of 1885 they were up to 38. Cole left the road's foreman position in the fall of 1885 by mutual and amicable agreement with Jake Rhodes, who had found a suitable replacement and who shook Cole's hand and told him the Mackay farm was lucky to have a man of his caliber, and Cole thanked him and came home and started the next phase of things. The next phase of things was a breeding program that Cole had been planning quietly for 2 years, working out the details in the evenings at the kitchen table with the kind of methodical thoroughness he brought to problems that were worth solving properly. He had an eye for cattle that Clara respected enormously. the ability to assess an animal the way some people assessed land, and he had been watching the quality of the herds in the region and forming opinions about what was missing and how to address it. He told her the plan across 3 evenings in October, laying it out piece by piece, and she listened and asked the questions she wanted answered and pushed back on the parts she was uncertain about, and he received all of it without defensiveness, and revised where the revisions were warranted and held his ground where he had good reason to. And by the end of the 3rd evening, they had agreed on a direction that satisfied both of them, and that Clara thought was genuinely good. "You are a remarkable farmer," she told him. "I am a fair one," he said, which was his version of accepting a compliment, which was to take it down 1 degree from what she had offered and then leave it there without argument. "Remarkable," she repeated, and he smiled at her across the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and said nothing, because she had made her point and he knew it. The letter from a man named Harlan Peel arrived in March of 1886, addressed to Cole at the Crestwater Post, and Cole brought it home without opening it and set it on the table with the expression he wore when he was uncertain how something was going to go. Harlan Peel was, it turned out, the trail boss from the incident in Dodge City in 1882, the one whose disagreement with another man had put a bullet through Cole's side and sent him bleeding across 4 days of Texas to end up on Clara's barn floor. He wrote to say that he had heard Cole was settled now, had a family and a farm, and that he wanted to express his regrets about the incident, which he apparently had felt the weight of in the intervening years. He wrote plainly and with no self-pity, and he offered no excuses. Cole read the letter twice and then gave it to Clara to read, and she read it and gave it back. "What do you want to do?" she said. He was quiet a moment. "Think I want to write back," he said. "Think I want to tell him that I hold no ill will and that the incident, inconvenient as it was, led me directly to where I am now and therefore he may consider the debt settled." She looked at him. "That is a generous way to see it." "It is an accurate way to see it," he said. "If I had not been shot, would have ridden into Crestwater presentable and on time and met you at the door the way I had planned. We might have been more cautious with each other. We might have taken months longer to arrive at the same place." He paused. "Or perhaps not. Perhaps we would have been exactly the same." He looked at her. "But I know that what we have was built in that barn in those 10 days, and I would not trade those 10 days. She thought about those 10 days, the lantern light and the carbolic and the needle and thread, the letters spread in the straw, the sound of his voice saying her name for the first time. She thought about the way she had known him before she saw his face, and how seeing his face had not changed what she knew but had added to it something she had not expected, the particular pleasure of a face that matched what you already understood about a person. "Write to him," she said. "Tell him what you told me." Cole wrote the letter, and Harlan Peel wrote back a month later to say he was grateful and to wish them well, and that was the end of that chapter, closed cleanly and without residue. James turned 3 in May of 1887, and had by that point become very clear in his personality, which was curious and determined and possessed of an opinion about almost everything, which both his parents found both amusing and occasionally challenging. He had Cole's steady gray eyes and Clara's straight dark hair and a laugh that seemed too large for his small frame, and he followed the cattle around the pasture with a proprietary air that Cole said was promising, and that Clara said was largely an imitation of Cole himself. "He watches everything you do," she told Cole one evening when James was in bed and they were sitting on the porch in the summer dark. "He is learning the work," Cole said. "He is learning you," she said. "The work is almost secondary." Cole was quiet for a moment. "I did not have that," he said. "Someone to watch and follow." "I know," she said. "You have said so. I think it makes a difference," he said. "I think a child who has someone to follow, who has someone worth following." He stopped. "It makes a difference," she said. "Of course it does." She reached over and found his hand on the armrest of his chair and held it. "You are someone worth following," she said. You have been since before I knew your face." He squeezed her hand. The summer dark was enormous around them, warm and full of the small sounds of the prairie, the crickets and the distant lowing of the cattle and the occasional sound of the wind through the windmill, and the stars above were as brilliant as they always were in the Texas dark, so numerous and so close that they seemed almost close enough to touch. "I'm glad the letter found you too," he said, echoing her words from 3 years before. "Are you?" she said, smiling. "Every day," he said, without variation. In the autumn of 1887, they had news from Ruth Callan that struck them both with the particular weight that the news of a neighbor's misfortune carries in a small place where everyone's fortunes are somewhat intertwined. Ruth's farm, which had been struggling since her husband died 4 years before, had suffered a particularly bad season, the crop failing and 2 of her cattle dying of disease, and she was in a position that Ruth, who was not a woman who asked for help easily, finally acknowledged she could not manage alone. Cole drove over the following Saturday with what Clara had organized in the kitchen, preserves and smoked meat, and a sack of grain from their reserves, and spent the afternoon repairing Ruth's roof, which had been leaking since July. Clara came with him and spent the afternoon with Ruth at her kitchen table, talking through the situation with the plain honesty that had always characterized their friendship. And by the time the afternoon was over, they had worked out an arrangement by which Ruth would keep her farm, but would pasture 6 of the Mackay cattle on her land in exchange for a percentage of the yield from her acreage, which helped both of them more than either could have managed entirely alone. Ruth, who was not sentimental, said that the arrangement was sensible and that she was glad to have neighbors worth having. Cole said the same was true from their end. James, who had come along in the wagon and spent the afternoon inspecting everything on Ruth's property with characteristic thoroughness, reported on the drive home that Mrs. Callan had a very good barn and that her rooster was the largest he had ever seen. "He is the largest rooster in Crestwater," Clara confirmed, and James accepted this with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment has been officially ratified. The second baby arrived in February of 1889, another boy they named Thomas, who was quieter than James from the beginning, a more deliberate and observant child, lying in his cradle watching everything around him with large attentive eyes that Cole said reminded him of the way certain horses watch the world, not passively, not anxiously, but with a quality of deep taking in that suggested much more was happening in the interior than was visible from the outside. James received Thomas with an initial wariness that resolved within a week into a proprietary affection, announcing to anyone who asked that the baby was his and also large for his size and likely to be useful eventually. Cole told him that was a reasonable assessment. Clara told him that his brother was a person, not a future farmhand. James considered this and announced that a brother could be both things simultaneously, and retreated to the barn before either parent could respond. "He is entirely you," Cole said to Clara, watching James disappear around the barn corner. "He is entirely both of us," she said, "which is the alarming part." The years of the late 1880s and into the early 1890s ran with the particular rhythm of a life that has found its shape, which is not the rhythm of excitement or dramatic turns, but which has its own deep quality, full and purposeful and real. The farm grew. The herd grew. Cole's breeding program produced results that were noticed by other cattlemen in the region, and he found himself consulted and occasionally hired to assess livestock for farms as far as 30 miles from Crestwater, which he did with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to his own work. Clara expanded the kitchen garden into something considerably larger than its original scope, and began selling produce to the hotel in Crestwater and to the cafe that opened in 1890, which brought in a regular income that supplemented the cattle operation. And which she managed with a business efficiency that impressed the hotel owner enough that he made her a standing offer that she kept open rather than deciding immediately, because she wanted to see how the arrangement developed before committing more deeply to it. She still wrote letters, because she had always been a woman who thought well in writing, but she wrote them now to her friend in Galveston, who she had grown up with and who had moved there after her marriage, and to a woman she had met through the church correspondence circle in Amarillo, who wrote about books and farming with equal enthusiasm, and with whom Clara had developed an honest and sustaining friendship by mail over several years. She sometimes thought about the particular alchemy of letter writing, the way honesty came more easily in a letter than in spoken conversation for some people, the way the page created a kind of privacy that allowed things to be said that the face-to-face world made more complicated. She thought about the July afternoon when she had sat at this kitchen table and written her first letter to a cowboy she had never seen, and what that letter had become, and what it had brought her. She was thinking about this one evening in the fall of 1891, sitting at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, with the lamp burning low and Cole across from her going over figures in the farm ledger, and she said, "Cole." He looked up. "Do you remember the advertisement?" she said. "The one in the Gazette?" He smiled, slow and certain. "I remember it," he said. "What made you place it?" she said. "I have wondered. You have told me parts of it, but not all of it. You were riding cattle across half the territory. You could have kept doing that." He set the ledger aside and leaned back in his chair and thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "I was 30 when I placed it," he said. "I was not old, but I was old enough to feel the difference between the life I was living and the life I wanted. I was good at the work I did. I liked the country. But at the end of every drive, it came back to an empty camp, and I got up the next morning and started again. And there was a year when I sat out in the middle of nothing on a night like this, all stars and grass, and I thought, this is beautiful, and I have no one to tell it is beautiful." He paused, and that felt like a problem worth addressing. "So you wrote an advertisement," she said. "So I wrote an advertisement," he agreed. "And you answered it." "I almost did not," she said. "I wrote the letter and then I set it on the table for 3 days before I mailed it. Thought it was a peculiar thing to do, and that I was perhaps not the kind of woman suited to doing peculiar things." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "And what changed your mind?" "Ruth Callan," she said. "She came for coffee and saw the letter and asked what it was, and I told her, and she said if I did not mail it she would never speak to me again, in those exact words." He laughed, genuinely and fully, and it was a sound she had been hearing for 9 years, and that still did something warm to the air in whatever room it was in. "I owe Ruth considerably more than I have ever given her credit for," he said. "She would tell you so if you brought it up," Clara said, "so perhaps do not bring it up." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for 9 years, and she held it the way she had been holding his for 9 years. And the lamp burned between them, and the Texas night pressed against the windows in its vast and patient way, and she thought about the advertisement, and the letter, and the barn, and the carbolic, and the needle and thread, and the bundle of letters in the coat pocket, and the slow smile by lamplight on the 8th day, and everything that had followed everything, all the way to this table and this lamp and this man's hand in hers. "I am glad Ruth came for coffee," Cole said. "So am I," Clara said, "spectacularly glad." By the spring of 1893, when James was nearly 9 and Thomas was 4, the Mackay farm was one of the most productive small operations in the county, a fact that had been acknowledged in the pages of the Amarillo Weekly Gazette in a piece about the growth of small farming operations in the region that mentioned Cole's breeding program and the quality of the herd by name. Clara read the article aloud at the kitchen table, and Cole listened with the expression of a man who is pleased but would never say so. And James listened with an expression of enormous pride that he also would not say aloud, because he was at the age where pride was something you wore internally, while presenting a face of studied calm. Thomas, who was 4, said the newspaper had a picture of a horse on the other side and asked if he could have it and was given it, and went away satisfied. That spring, they made the decision that they had been talking about in pieces for 2 years, which was to build a proper house. The farmhouse that Clara had inherited from her father was sound but small, 3 rooms, and with 4 people in it and the farm growing it had become cramped in a way that was manageable but increasingly so. Cole had been thinking about the design for some time, laying it out in his head the way he laid out everything, methodically, and with attention to what was actually needed as opposed to what might look impressive. They built the house over the summer of 1893, Cole doing the bulk of the carpentry himself with help from Tom Aldridge's son, and a young man from town named Eli Greer, who was learning the trade, and who Cole taught with the same patient thoroughness he brought to teaching James how to work cattle. The new house had 5 rooms, a proper parlor, a kitchen that was twice the size of the old one, 2 bedrooms for the boys and 1 for Clara and Cole, and a covered porch that ran along the south side and looked out over the land in a way that Clara had specified exactly, because she knew the view she wanted to look at from her own porch for the rest of her life. They moved into the new house on the 1st of September, 1893, and Clara walked through every room twice before she was satisfied, and stood on the south porch in the early evening and looked at the land in the particular low golden light that September evenings had in Texas, the grass golden and the shadows long and the sky beginning to deepen toward the color it got at dusk, and she felt the fullness of it, what they had built, all of it, the farm and the house and the life inside it. Cole came out and stood beside her and looked at the same view. "You built this," he said. "We built this," she said. "You started it," he said. "Long before I arrived, you kept this land standing." "And then you arrived," she said, "through my barn floor." "Through your barn floor," he confirmed. "In the least graceful manner possible," she laughed. "It was not graceful," she said, "but it was effective." He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built on the land she had kept and looked at the country that had shaped them both, the enormous, indifferent, beautiful country that asked only that you be equal to it, and she felt that they were, that they had been, and that they would continue to be. James came out through the door behind them, 9 years old and already tall, with Cole's serious eyes and Clara's direct manner, and stood on the porch beside them and looked at the view with an expression of assessment. "It is a good house," he said. "Yes," Cole said, "it is." "Can I have the room on the south side?" James said. "Thomas is in the room on the south side," Clara said. "He is 4, James said. "He does not know what south means." "He will learn," Cole said. "South room is Thomas's. You have the east room." James considered this. "East is where the sun comes up," he said. "Yes," Cole said. "I suppose that is acceptable," James said, and went back inside, and Clara heard him telling Thomas with enormous authority that east was actually better than south and Thomas should feel sorry for himself. Cole shook his head slowly. "He is entirely you," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being true," he said. She leaned against him, and the evening deepened around them, and the first star appeared above the horizon, and the land went still in the particular way, the land went still at dusk, the grass settling and the sky changing colors in layers from gold to amber to the deep pure blue that preceded. The dark and everything she had was present in that moment, the house at her back and the land at her front, and the man beside her and the sounds of her boys inside. And she held all of it the way you hold something you know is real and true and entirely yours. She had written a letter in July of 1882 to a cowboy she had never met. The letter had found him on a trail outside of Dodge City, and he had read it sitting on the tailgate of a supply wagon in the afternoon heat, and he had read it twice and then written back, and the letters had gone back and forth through the summer and into the fall, building something between two people who had never stood in the same room. And then he had ridden 4 days across the Texas plains to find her, and had found her barn first, and she had knelt in the straw with carbolic and thread and kept him in the world. And the world had kept them together, in this place, on this land, with this life between them that was everything a life was supposed to be, large enough to live in, honest enough to trust, and built on a foundation that had started with a letter and a barn and a kind of grace that neither of them had planned, but that both of them had had the sense to recognize and hold. In the years that followed, the children grew and the farm grew, and the seasons turned over the Texas plains with their reliable and ancient rhythm, and Clara and Cole grew with them, deeper into the life they had made, deeper into each other, in the way that people grow who have started with honesty and have not departed from it. James learned the land the way Cole had learned it, from the ground up and with his whole attention, and by the time he was 12, he could assess a head of cattle better than most grown men in the county, which Cole acknowledged without sentimentality, and which James received without false modesty, because both of them were constitutionally averse to pretense. Thomas turned out to have a gift for figures and a fascination with the machinery of things, the windmills and the water systems and the workings of the farm's mechanical elements, and Cole encouraged it without trying to direct it toward cattle work if it was not what Thomas was drawn to, because he believed, as he had told Clara once, that a person's nature was not something to argue with but something to work with. Clara continued to write. She wrote letters and she wrote in the journal she had kept since she was 17, and sometimes in the evenings when the boys were in bed and Cole was sitting with the farm ledger, she would read him what she had written, not all of it, but the parts she wanted another pair of ears on, and he listened in the particular way he listened to her, which was with his whole attention and his honest opinion. She wrote, one October evening in 1897, about the barn. She read it aloud to him, and he sat still through the reading, the ledger closed on the table, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "You wrote about the needle and thread," he said. "You remember that," she said. "I was conscious for some of it," he said, "more than I let on." She looked up from the journal. "Were you?" "I heard you talking," he said. "Could not answer. But I heard you." She thought about what she had said in that barn in the dark, to an unconscious man she did not yet know she already knew. She thought about the things she had told him that she had not intended to tell him, or had intended to tell him without expecting him to hear. She felt the color rise in her face slightly, which was not something that happened to her often. "What did you hear?" she said. He looked at her with the slow-settling smile that had not changed in 15 years, that still arrived at his eyes before it fully reached his mouth. "Heard someone who knew how to take care of what mattered," he said, "and I thought if I wake up from this, would like to know her better." She looked at him across the lamp and the table and the years and said, "You did wake up." "I did," he said, "and I did." She closed the journal and reached across the table, and he met her hand halfway, the way he always did, and held it, and the October dark pressed against the windows of the house they had built on the land she had kept, and the stars above the Texas plains were as brilliant and as numerous as they had always been, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called once, and the land absorbed the sound the way it absorbed everything, into its vast and patient silence. She thought about the July afternoon and the letter and the stranger in the barn and the bundle of letters tied with brown string, and she thought about the ways that lives turned on small decisions made without knowing what they would become, and she was grateful. She was entirely and specifically grateful for the afternoon she had sat at this table, at this same table, and written the first letter. She was grateful for the 3 days she had left it sitting there before Ruth Callan came for coffee. She was grateful for Ruth Callan. She was grateful for the Amarillo Weekly Gazette. And she was most grateful for the cowboy from New Mexico Territory, who had read her letter sitting on the tailgate of a supply wagon in the summer heat, and had recognized in her words something worth riding 4 days through the Texas plains to find. He had found it. They had found it together, and they had not let go of it, not once, not for a single day of all the days that had followed. And she knew with the particular certainty of someone who has held a thing long enough to understand its weight that they never would. "Cole," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you for the advertisement," she said, "in the Gazette." He laughed then, full and real, the laugh that still did something warm to the air in whatever room it was in, and he said, "Thank you for answering it." And outside the Texas night spread away in every direction in its enormous and indifferent beauty, and inside the lamp burned between them, and she held his hand, and the story that had begun with a letter was still being written, and would be, she thought, for a long time yet.